I was getting worried at the end of January that this was the big one. They held the independent committee meeting at WHO of the Public Health Emergency of International Concern on the 23rd of January. And this was only really a few days after everything exploded in China and people were dead in the streets. And it was clear this was not flu. This was something very different.
The first thing was really when I heard about it leaving China. I thought, that is really worrying.
You could see countries taking action, you could hear the alarm bells, you already saw what was happening in China and Hong Kong, and yet here, almost nothing was happening.
And then when I saw the photographs of Italy, that's when it emotionally struck home, because I knew it was coming here, I knew it was going to be bad.
And when there is a risk that new diseases such as coronavirus will trigger a panic and a desire for market segregation that go beyond what is medically rational, then, at that moment, humanity needs some government somewhere that is willing at least to make the case powerfully for freedom of exchange.
Perhaps you could sort of kick it on the chin and allow the disease, as it were, to move through the population.
The vast majority of people get a mild illness to build up some degree of herd immunity.
Polidor running on from the back of the field, ninth edition as well. With a perfect time to score his first Anfield goal of the season.
I was at a hospital the other night where there were actually a few coronavirus patients, and I shook hands with everybody.
At around 7 o'clock tonight, the Prime Minister was taken to intensive care.
The Prime Minister's condition was more serious than we were being led to believe.
We've been following scientific and medical advice.
We follow very carefully and deliberately the scientific and medical advice. The government's approach is to follow scientific and medical advice.
They said we were following the science, but we didn't know what the science was. And we didn't know at that time that their definition of science was very narrow.
28,734 people have died.
Good afternoon. Thank you for coming.
I was astonished that Dominic Cummings was on stage. I wasn't totally surprised because I thought that he was the kind of person that would make sure he was there, because he was clearly the most powerful person affecting government policy for decades, probably, that would very much distort the room.
When I was Chief Scientific Advisor, I made it very, very clear to the Prime Ministers, Blair and Brown, that I gave my advice to them and then put it into the public domain. But I didn't want what I put into the public domain to be fettered at all by any political interference. When we come to the current pandemic, we know that we always had Prime Minister or a Minister there with advisors either side of them.
You can't mobilise and inform a nation on press briefings from Westminster. I liked the idea of a shadow sage, a kind of independent sage, as soon as I learnt about the balance of the existing sage and the lack of the public health.
I think these are critically important parts of bringing a pandemic under control and being open and honest with the public as you do this, so that you're taking them along with you and you're getting their trust.
The government's secretive Scientific Advisory Group for Emergencies is still withholding the minutes of its meetings. But after 6 weeks of lockdown, the names of those on the committee have finally been published.
At the time, there wasn't any transparency. So I said yes, but I said yes to what I thought would be a 2-hour meeting. I didn't say yes to what IndieSage turned out to be, and it very much evolved in response to what happened. And it was partly more like, as the summer progressed, the government stepped back and back and back, particularly after the whole kind of going up to Barnard Castle. It was like, open, open, open. So we ended up having to take on a role of actually saying it's not over, and taking on that responsibility. And we felt like we couldn't step away, that it was just too dangerous to give this kind of impression that things were over.
That summer was wasted. It was the triumphalism of defeating the virus. And therefore, when there was the inevitable next wave, the surge in September and October, when schools came back, when universities came back, we were just not set up at all to deal with that.
By end of August, early September, it was clear that case numbers were rising, and towards the end of September, SAGE came out based on modelling that there was going to be a big second surge unless they could do what they called a circuit break, or a 2-week break. And we absolutely supported that. We thought that was the right thing to do. We were also arguing that if you'd introduced a proper, non-outsourced find, test, trace and isolate, we could also keep it under control and stop any further lockdowns. And of course they didn't do that. They waited, I think, until November, when they were forced to go into lockdown. And it was around that time that none of us really spotted that there was the new variant had come in, which really threw the cat amongst the pigeons, because it increased the R value and it took off. But again, they delayed. Again, SAGE and Independent SAGE were both saying well before Christmas that we should be locking down. And Boris Johnson decided, really personally, I think, that he was going to wait. And the estimates are that that led to many thousands of deaths.
Cases are higher now than they were before lockdown. We're at the highest level of hospital admissions than we have been in the second wave. I mean, we're not in a situation where we can afford to relax further. And the people who will get sick and die because of it are the people who'd be first in line for the vaccine in January. I mean, that's just tragic to me.
Prime Minister Boris Johnson, whose handling of the pandemic has been heavily criticised in some quarters, said he was deeply sorry for every life lost and that he took full responsibility for everything that the government has done.
So one of the unfortunate events over the pandemic was my mother getting COVID and dying from COVID. My brother, who is based in the United States, has not been able to see my mother for more than a year. And so he had to look from afar as the news came of her getting COVID and then going downhill. And all funerals are sort of now webcast, and we're unable to have a sort of more formal celebration of her life that we would have wanted to. That's that's a sadness for me.
Knowing that it could have been different, knowing that this government, had they gone down hard with lockdowns right at the beginning, had they stayed in lockdowns instead of messing around with the eat out and help out and opening up the economy only to shut it again, and had they stopped dithering and taken that action, that things could have been different.
If we just look at the economic damage to the country and the number of lives lost, we just see how the terrible misunderstanding at the beginning that our economy will keep growing because we will just take the hit amongst the older part of our population. And I do believe that was a decision early on, has been disastrous both for the economy and the number of lives lost. The worst record in the world on those two.
I think it is a really interesting model, and it's a really interesting new way to hold those in authority to account with an authoritative group of people, of alternative experts. It's much better for those questions to come from scientists, from peers, than from ignorant journalists. So I think it's been a really interesting and welcome establishment that I think would be really useful. if it is continued and copied in the future.
There's nothing more important than to be holding power to account at a time like a pandemic. And I think one of the concerning things about the way in which the government was acting was that so much of the advice that they were being given was still being kept secret. I mean, we didn't even know who was on the official SAGE committee until very late on. Their documents weren't put into the public domain until very late on. And one of the things that I really appreciated about independent SAGE was the transparency, the willingness to be accountable, to really kind of open up and let the public in to see the kinds of decisions that need to be taken, the kinds of trade-offs that need to be made, so that we can understand that whole process better. And I think as a result, independent SAGE just had so much more authority and credibility.
I do think we've made a new discovery, that an independent science advisory group being able to have discussions with the public through public meetings, being able to give good advice on a daily basis into the media, freely given, is an extraordinary step forward.
You know, our lives were taken over a year ago, and it's what people have been talking about. It's been in the news every day. So there's been an appetite for hearing from scientists in a way that there may not be for equally important issues that just don't have that immediacy.
I think what this pandemic has done is to shine a spotlight on grotesque levels of inequality that pre-existed it, but which have been exacerbated by it. And so any idea of going back to normal, I think is just simply not good enough.
What we have learnt in this pandemic is that class is a risk factor, is that race is a risk factor.
We absolutely have to tackle the inequality issue, because we were a very fragile, non-resilient society when COVID came along.
I would argue that we don't want to just build that back better. We want to build back differently, because the old normal didn't work. The old normal meant that there were gaping structural inequalities, which we already knew meant that people from different backgrounds had different life expectancies.
The human cost of this has been overwhelming. And I guess my reflections about the government is that one of the most frustrating things is that they keep making the same mistakes over and over again. I think maybe you could cut them a bit of slack, perhaps last March. They clearly didn't lock down soon enough, but perhaps you could say, well, there were conflicting voices. Maybe that was a difficult decision to make. Undoubtedly it was. But the truth is that they have been slow into every other lockdown that has happened. They're being slow right now when it comes to border controls. And I think what's so unforgivable is when we have a government that keeps making the same mistake time after time.
So we failed to persuade the government of the importance of find, test, trace and isolate. They simply haven't done it. They've implemented a system that is more based on ideology. We've been saying it every week for a year. We're still saying it, and we're deeply concerned that despite the vaccine, and the vaccine's been great, and of course we want everyone vaccinated, but ultimately you need not just a vaccine, but you need the social element, and you need any outbreaks to be snuffed out quickly. And to do that, you need to isolate. And for that, you need to give the money and support that people need to enable them to do it. We are absolutely in danger, because if a new variant comes in that's more transmissible and it kicks off again, what is the government going to do about it? We don't know how long vaccine immunity will last. We don't know about new variants. There is a real risk that things will come up again. We are in danger.
I think there's absolutely no doubt at all that the process by which SAGE was secret, and overall the whole thinking around the strategy was secret, was an absolutely catastrophic mistake.